given a brief introduction, is our Vice Chair on the National Committee, one of our delegates from Vermont on the National Committee, but is here to talk to us about his experience with real estate development, the housing market, housing policy, and what this means for the Northeast, and how we can, of course, as a party, learn and continue to support the communities that we're in through progressive housing policy. So take it away, Scott.
Just make sure the arrows work. Oh, look at that. Cool. So, what I'd like to do is, well, first of all, let me say thank you for staying the entire time and being here to talk about housing. I didn't come to being a property developer from the traditional route. I don't come from a family of multiple generations of builders. I didn't go to school for it. My chosen profession was actually as a performing artist, and I've owned other businesses in the past. And I also worked a lot in economic development, and it was through the work I was doing in economic development that I came to the conclusion that we needed to do something about housing. And so now, in the current city I live in is Rutland, Vermont. Moved there 4 years ago after growing up in Massachusetts, and we all affectionately call ourselves housers in Rutland. So this is going to be a presentation about housers, and I'm going to go through some fundamentals that I think are important to framing the conversation. We're going to go through some myths, and then we'll talk about some components that I believe. I'm not going to show us the be-all, end-all for a housing strategy, but these are among the things that I think are structurally most important to having a YNP national housing strategy. By the way, part of what influenced me in putting this presentation together was, I don't know if anyone else caught the irony last 4th of July, but the irony was not lost on me that, our federal government, of course, currently really makes no apologies for its stances. And I found it prophetic that on the 4th of July, an opportunity which they decided to take an opportunity and really focus on the built environment, if you want to think of it that way. But instead of presenting a national housing strategy at a time where not since the Great Depression have we had such an issue and a set of challenges related to housing and the built environment, but the choice, of course, was to present to us Alligator Alcatraz. I thought, wow. So, they let us know what they're thinking about the future and the future of the built environment by doing so. And so I've been out a lot in other parts of the United States and New England since then talking about these things. So why would we even consider putting together a national housing strategy? Well, there's an industrial benefit. Housing and the built environment encompasses a lot of industries, not just one. That's why housing, generally speaking, when we measure the economy, has been historically so important. It represents a variety of different industrial sectors. When done right, it can be an economic powerhouse, and it can affect positively the lives of many different types of people across many different socioeconomic strata. There's the economic benefit beyond just individuals. Poor financial and policy design aside, housing underpins our economy like virtually no other asset class can. It's also in the way that it ties us to the land, it ties us to each other in a way that private equity and stocks and things like that do not. And then lastly, there's of course a social benefit. In this or any democracy, it should be a fundamental right to exist in a stable housing environment. There's not, if you can't find your way to this morally, if people have a variety of other challenges going on in their lives, it's very difficult for them to deal with those. If I have mental health issues, if I have, really just any other type of issue in my life, it's very difficult to deal with those when I'm couch surfing, or I'm living out of my car, or I'm freezing to death. 2 years ago, as the homelessness issue in Vermont started to really heat up. There was a young couple in their 30s in Woolcott, which is not too far outside of Burlington, who froze to death at night. And when we were talking about this in Rutland, somebody had said, well, that's sad, but these people should have jobs. Well, they did have jobs. Well, how do you know that? Because they froze to death in a tent next to their car. They were gainfully employed, both of them, but they didn't make enough money any longer to afford an apartment anywhere in the city of Burlington. And they were squatting on somebody's land that they knew. And unlucky for them, it was cold enough that night, as it gets very cold in the mountains in Vermont, they accidentally froze to death in a tent next to their car. Most of the homeless, I wouldn't say majority, but most of the homeless in my city, Rutland, and we have a high concentration of the homeless, particularly post-COVID, in the entire state because of our former motel program. A lot of people relocated to Rutland because we have a lion's share of the motels in the state. And most of these people are living in cars. So if you have a car, you have a job. And I just point that out because it speaks kind of systemically to, there's a systemic issue. It's not that people aren't working hard enough or anything like that. Now, I just want to set, again, the stage, the right framework, or the filter by which we're talking. What's happening, we're here to talk about housing right now, but we're really in the midst of a poly crisis. If we're going to have a mature conversation about housing, or for that matter, any of the other sort of major systems issues that I highlight here, and this is only a partial list, but all of these things are very much interrelated, right? Virtually every major system that we've come to rely on that we feel are necessary for society to function are in some state of crisis. They're starting to fail an ever-increasing number of people, especially in the middle working and lower classes. So policy decisions that are made, they have to take into effect all of the other major systems. And I'm a glass half full person. So I look at, hey, how can we address positively and find opportunities within all these systems to make better decisions that create a much more sustainable environment, and how can we work together? Energy is a good example. I was having a conversation earlier today about, well, if we're going to develop better, more sustainable middle market and market rate housing, can we do so at the same time we're developing more decentralized and more varied forms of renewable energy on each one of those properties? We can. We can even set policy that helps us do that, that encourages more of that, right? That would just be one example. I also believe, and this is more just me personally now, policy decisions must use private property as a core incentive. So I believe that we can still very much make capitalism work because I'm sort of a John Stuart Mill kind of guy. The incentive of private property, people's desire to own a little piece of something, no matter how small or big, when in balance with the needs of everybody else, is a powerful incentive, and that it could really work. And lastly, that we have a real bottom-up approach to housing. And what I simply mean by that, anybody here know of or follow Strong Towns? Here we go, Kate. I'm on their leadership cohort this year. I've been with Strong Towns for 11 years. And Strong Towns believes in this idea of a bottom-up approach. That is to say that decisions should be made with as much public input as possible. That's not always easy, but it should be made with as much public input as possible, but also that decisions are made at the most suitable local level that they possibly can, right? So you wouldn't necessarily advocate for a central office approach, a top-down approach to making decisions about what gets built, because what gets built in Los Angeles may not be as good for Burlington, Vermont, may not be what we want in Boston, may not be what we want in the smallest town in Massachusetts, I think is Monroe. I think they got about 100 people in Monroe. And anybody from Monroe? Okay. Just to see, you know. Statistically impossible, yeah. Now we're going to break down a couple of myths, okay? Myth number one. I don't want apartment complexes in my town because they bring down home values. Now, I have lived in Vermont the entire time that my former home state, the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, was passing the legislation around zoning changes around where the train stations are. Anybody seen on LinkedIn some of the public testimony at city and town? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, right? So, people were getting up and saying, listen, I've lived in this town for 50 years, I got all my money invested in my house, and I don't want my property values to go down. It's a myth. I can cite to you right now 17 studies. Half of those were done in the last 5 years alone, but they go back, some of them go back many years. Even organizations whose intent in creating studies to show that multifamily housing brings down home values could not find anywhere where that's ever happened. In short, having a wider spectrum of housing by type in any given community actually increases values. Part of that, not all of it, but part of it is driven by the fact that you have a wider spectrum of people and socioeconomics within one town, and then people start to build equity and they can rise up the housing escalator, if you will, okay? Second myth. Now I'm really hoping that some of the things that I mentioned piss somebody off, because I'm hoping to get through this quickly and we can have a conversation, and it'd be really great to debate some things. I like tension. Tension's good. I'm a jazz musician by trade. So myth number 2, this town is lucky to have me, because my expensive single-family home generates so much in property taxes, I resent paying for everybody else. Now, there's an important principle in municipal planning called the tax revenue per acre ratio. Raise your hand if you've heard of the tax revenue per acre ratio. So that's cool. A bunch of people have heard of that. Long and short of it is, the more, when we talk about what some people now in the modern era call mixed-use properties, right? Look at any typical downtown of any size, anywhere, not only in the United States, but anywhere, okay? And you have buildings that usually mix uses, right? You have little shops on the first floor, and then you have multiple above and so forth. The short answer here is, the more density per acre you create, the more tax revenue you create, or tax revenue potential on that site. The terminology we use today in 2026, our ancestors did not have this, okay? But they knew inherently, hey man, if I build this building to have a bunch of apartments in it, and commercial property on the first floor, and if I make the space in general flexible so that with the passing decades I could change it depending on what the economy is doing. All of these buildings were designed at 40, 45, 50% of occupancy to still cash flow, regardless of what the outside economy was doing, right? In other words, people were building for like 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And those buildings that still exist, even in downtowns that have been hollowed out by suburbanization, they still, so I used to own 2 commercial properties in the town of Derry, New Hampshire. I had a music store there, I had 5 tenants besides. And the Guitar Center down the road, not that I'm bitter or anything, but they got like 20 years of free taxes because they built them all, right? My shop and the shops all up and down Londonderry and Derry that were in old buildings, we were subsidizing essentially their taxes. And on top of that, those miles of pipe, the infrastructure underneath the ground that we run to those suburban commercial single-use centers, right? 20 years of free taxes, what happens when after 20 years you got to replace pipe? It's expensive and you don't have any money to do it. So, those old buildings, think about it though, even in downtowns that are hollowed out, dilapidated state, there's still enough tax revenue there, it's subsidizing the other people. So that's another powerful myth. It's just financially not true. Myth number 3, I don't want more families moving to my town because they bring kids, and that means more money for schools, and that means my taxes are going to go up. In the election, last year's municipal elections in my city, Rutland, Vermont, a woman was quoted in the paper saying, I'm not going to vote for the current mayor, Mayor Mike, who quit 3 weeks before the election this year, by the way. Well, I'm going to vote for Mike because Mike has this goal of 1,000 units of housing in 5 years. And that means more young people, and that means more families. And I take care of retirees, people on a fixed income, and these people can't suffer any more increases to their property taxes for schools. Now, it is true that if you have more young families in your town, you're going to have more kids, and more kids mean the schools need funding, right? But there's another important thing about those young families. They're working. Because if they own a home and they're paying property taxes, or even if they're renting, their landlord is paying property taxes. And they have a lot of them struggling, but technically in a perfect world, they can pay property taxes. I'm a homeowner, I pay my property taxes. And I have kids too. Now, if the opposite's happening, if you're voting to eliminate those households, if you've ever worked for municipalities, and I know many of you either have or do, you understand there's two choices that a city or a town has to raise taxes. Either through some form of organic growth, we have more households to pay the same amount of taxes, and the increases are spread out over more households, or you got to put the screws to the same number of people. And in a place where the local economy is not growing, or cannot sustain, the current people, it's primarily young people who have the capability to leave, and they do. In our home state of Vermont, young people have been leaving for a very long time because local economies cannot sustain them with desirable and professional class wages and desirable work too. And so they leave. Who are you left with? You're left with people who are so poor they have no choice, and you're left with people on a fixed income. And people on a fixed income cannot take tax increases, especially the big ones. In the 4 years I lived in Vermont, 1 year we had an 18% property tax increase. Because we don't have, Massachusetts has Prop 2.5, we don't have that in Vermont. They can go up as high as you can make them. And sometimes they do. Myth number 4. This is the one that gets me in a lot of trouble with people. Rent control will solve all our community's problems of affordability. I have a white paper coming out I wrote for a former, well, I guess a current client. This client is attempting to launch a national housing initiative. We studied rent control going back to the Roman times. Rent control, particularly in the lens of longer term, years, not just once or in an emergency, it's never worked. It hasn't worked ever. Not ever. It sounds good. The problem with it, there's many ways you can measure the problem, but the real problem is you cannot create a sustainable environment with any initiative or any policy you could ever pass. If it's hurting one group over another, or it's favoring one group over another. We have to agree that the long-term goal is to create some form of sustainable environment, a self-perpetuating machine that's going to keep the wheels of the economy going, right? So, now, there are some cases I can agree with a little bit of rent control, a little bit. Like, there's an emergency, like COVID, right? I mean, for that matter, not just rent, we could have had a debt holiday for a period of time in this economy based on debt, where no one's debt goes away, but since no one can go to work, and since putting certain people to work is a dangerous thing, how about we just have a debt holiday for a while? We could have done that. We didn't do that. So in select cases like that, maybe rent control works for a brief period of time. Inevitably, though, in practice, the longer it goes on, especially when you have rent control where it's electeds have to make the decision of when we're going to adjust. Now the decision is not based on the economy. It's not based on economic factors. It's based on elections and favoritism or whatever, right? And people say, well, yeah, but, man, those landlords, man, they're capitalist pig dogs, well, most of your landlords are not. In Vermont, the average property owner with a rental unit owns 1.7 units. It's weird, right? Like, who owns that 7/10? It must be a small ass place, right? No. It means that the vast majority of these people, they live in owner-occupied homes, right? 85% of our landlords in Rutland, and there's a lot of rentals in Rutland, 85% of them are owner-occupied. So mostly landlords are our neighbors. They're us, right? And so they're the first to not weather rent control, which leaves you in the end with all your largest developers and landlords. And I'm not vilifying big landlords and developers, but because some of them are good. But what I'm saying is you're not creating a resilient environment for small scale anything when you do that, right? Anyways, those are just 4 myths. There are a lot of other myths, but those are the four that come up quite often the most. A YNP national housing strategy to me would be rooted in the ideals of the Commonwealth, right? I grew up in Massachusetts, so my ideas about what is a Commonwealth are largely rooted in my study of history of the English Civil War and of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I'm not referring to the original Mass Bay Colony that was basically, a paternal theocracy. And any of you that might know, or might be interested in those that don't know, it was pretty much like you had to have what they called a miracle. This is the Puritans, right? And when you had a miracle, you were an adult. It's like having an epiphany, and then you needed to prove that to the elders in the church. And if you did, you were now yourself an adult in the eyes of the church. You're fully baptized into the Puritan church. And interestingly enough, in the first half century of the Commonwealth, the Mass Bay Colony rather, only propertied white males were having these miracles. And then people like Aunt Hutchinson came along. She was like, I'm pretty sure the other night I had a miracle. And they were like, you go fund Rhode Island, right? So, no, I'm talking about, in some extent, I'm talking about inventing a renewed sense of Commonwealth, right? And I'm talking about the definition of like, all ships rise, we work together, right? When I say that. And so any sort of strategy around any portion of the economy, whether it's housing like we're talking about today or just the economy in general, really needs to be rooted in the idea that it has to work together. It has to be, that's part of being sustainable, right? Just to give a sense for 3 examples here of the scale of what I consider to be an opportunity. It is a challenge, it's a crisis, it's also an opportunity, right? In Massachusetts, and these numbers are partially based on, I add a lot of what we call the replacement rate is. So not just, hey, we know we need X number of units just to keep pace without losing more population. I'm talking about also replacing a lot of old stock. So Massachusetts, it's actually for the next decade, close to 400,000 units need to be built all throughout the Commonwealth. The Vermont Futures Project recently published some updates to our numbers in Vermont. I've added more units to that because in Vermont, 75% of our entire housing stock, lock, stock, and barrel, even the abandoned stuff, was built before 1940. So we have of the 6 New England states, we have the oldest overall housing stock, and it's, as you can imagine, a lot of it's pretty dilapidated. So we need about 80,000 units over the next decade built. That's also just so that we stop the bleeding in our population. Part of what makes Vermont so expensive out of it to live, part of the reason why healthcare there is completely unaffordable at this point for the vast majority of the population, frankly, is the fact that our risk pool, that is to say the people who need the health insurance, it skews so much older. And it skews older because young people cannot find a place to live. And they certainly can't find any place that's affordable. Maine's latest numbers, 84,300 units. So, and the list goes on. You can look at Connecticut, you can look at Rhode Island, New York State. The percentage of housing stock needed and the reasons for that need are very similar. Because really, this is ultimately a problem in the United States. It's particularly acute here in the Northeast for a number of reasons. So we should, if we're smart, to me, look at this as an opportunity, right? How do we fix this? The Northeast, New England and all the other states that comprise the Northeast are a significant amount of this nation's total GDP. That's also leverage, by the way. If we stop paying our federal taxes, Washington's in trouble, right? And we are a desirable place to be, so much so that we've created a very expensive place. There are things we can do, we can fix that. And structurally, we can make it easier for people to get a leg up and to participate. So it's not that I'm saying we should take any of that value away, but we have to figure out how we share more of that value amongst ourselves, so that in turn we're creating yet more value. I think that another measure of how we should root our housing strategy would be a fairly Keynesian approach. John Maynard Keynes, the economist. The New Deal was largely based on a Keynesian approach to the economy. You can look my man up. I'm a fan, and that is to say that large public expenditures can be had, and put into a strategy like this. Keynes essentially, in a modern economy, felt that large public expenditure to boost the economy when the economy was down was a smart approach, because in a modern industrialized economy, it was really the only way without hurting the population to reinvigorate the economy. That's a very, very simplified version of what Keynesian was about, but we don't have a lot of time. So, I'm gonna adjust my pages. I had something super cool to say to you right now, and I totally forgot what I was gonna say. So this would be a focus on housing as a driver alongside other important and significant investments made in major sectors. You can't have a mature conversation about housing without, there's many reasons why we have a housing crisis. At the apex of that is inventory, but it's also the fact that more and more people are making less and less in their household income, right? So some more statistics. In Rutland County, Vermont, where I live, 60,000 people. The average median income for the state of Vermont is somewhere around $140,000. In fact, it's $136,000 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, as a parent, right? That means that a family household of some size needs to make $136,000 a year minimum just to remain at 100% average median income and not fall below that. Falling below that means, in housing terms, it means you're probably paying 30 to 50% of your income just for your housing, whether you own a house or you rent. The average income in Rutland County is $64,000 a year. Right? And you look at right across the board, even in wealthy counties like Worcester County, Massachusetts, or Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and it's very similar numbers. I mean, not everybody's making $140,000 a year, right? And so that becomes a problem. In Rutland City, 46% of our population pays between 30 to 50% of their income, both renters and mortgagees, on their housing. 14% pay more than 50% on their housing. So that's the people that when our electeds talk about, there's a certain number of people who are, living paycheck to paycheck. That's living paycheck to paycheck. And healthcare, if you're on the state health connector in Vermont, I think it's up 30%. I switched recently. I literally can't afford to pay for my own health coverage. And I'm not wealthy, but I'm not poor. Not anymore. But I gotta tell you, it went up. If I was paying, I'd be paying $3,800 a month. That's what it went up to. Luckily, I was able to find an alternative. Again, because I risk pool. More young people leave, we don't have the right risk pool, it continues to go up. Housing is a major driver. That's how these things are interconnected. Another thing I'm just gonna, again, not gonna get too in the weeds on, but inflation is important to mention here because the numbers are big. That's what I was just illustrating as far as households go and household income. That's been going on since the dawn of currency, right? So that's just something important to know. In that, a serious conversation about any sort of housing policy, we have to think about how are we going to weather better in the future major inflationary events. Some other more specific policy parameters, right? You heard me say something about density before. Even in rural environments, density, the tax revenue per acre ratio, that should be used to our advantage, okay? Even in rural environments, not everybody wants to live and not see their neighbors, okay? And when we talk about creating different forms of housing that are more affordable than others and still trying to get to market rate, let's assume that everybody's got a job that's paying well, right? Density can be used to our advantage to create a much more sustainable environment, right? So we want to increase density to an appropriate amount wherever we're talking about as much as possible. This is also made easier by the fact that New England's an old place, okay? There's a lot of infill opportunity. I'm writing a white paper right now on a southern Vermont strategy. It's not done yet, but I think we could have more than 10,000 units of housing in southern Vermont, and probably somewhere around 55% of that just building on house lots that no longer have a house on them. Many of which, we don't have a lot of public infrastructure in Vermont. Most of our towns are all on septic. But Rutland City, where I live, just to give you some perspective, second largest city in the state. There's 16,500 people in this city of Rutland. Okay? We have more than 220 lots within city bounds that are abandoned, taken by tax delinquency, that are city owned. And we have an equal number that were not taken in tax delinquency, they just, for some other means that the city has. It's a city of 16,000 people, we have over 400 lots available that could have a house on them again. And by the way, we have public water and sewer infrastructure. And we're wondering, geez, that other stuff needs to be fixed, how are we gonna pay for it? I'm pretty sure we can pay for it over the next 50 years with a bond for 40 or 50 million bucks if we had another $2 to $3 million in property taxes kicking around. And it's the same way to some greater or lesser extent in virtually every city and town, anywhere in the Northeast. We don't have a housing crisis. We have a focus crisis. Right? We've got to move past what I call the adversarial trap. Well, I don't believe in market rate housing because, we really need a lot more affordable housing. Or, I don't believe in affordable housing. I just want to build luxury because, I got my reasons for doing it. We've got to stop the us versus them. The world is not black and white, right? And life is not a football game. And we've been trained to think in terms of winners and losers and this and that. But we got to get away from that. Because when we talk about when I talk about middle market housing, I'm talking about a pretty wide spectrum, right? I'm talking about that coupled with smart economic development policy, right? You have more people that can afford more of a home. We've got to provide that middle class housing again, starter homes, duplexes, triplexes, and all that. That's also on here, right? That's what I mean by missing middle and middle market housing, right? We need a wider spectrum of homes. And a lot of times we get closer to affordability, not necessarily by subsidizing, but just by building smaller, right? Maybe somebody can afford a single family home, but do we have to put it on 2.5 acres? I don't think so. We can put it on less land because they don't necessarily need that, right? There's all different kinds of things we can do to get a wider spectrum of housing, a wider spectrum of circumstances, so more people can afford what they want, and it'll be available to them in the community which they choose to reside. We also want to encourage all the different forms of innovation within the housing environment that there can possibly be. Most people think, well, yeah, like in the built environment, there's plenty of examples of that. New construction processes, materials innovation, renewable energy, you name it, right? Robotics, but it can also be innovation in the financial markets, right? At one time, the 30-year mortgage was an innovation, and it was designed to respond to a very specific problem. And it was designed along with a lot of other either financial instruments in the banking system, but also financial and currency policy in Washington to get us out of the Great Depression. And then it was amended again after World War II because, hey, what are we going to do with all these guys coming back? Mostly guys, there were plenty of gals too there in the war. Where are they going to live, right? And we created suburbia. And at that time, suburbia seemed like a great thing. Financially, it's not working out so great. But what I'm saying to you is, all that policy, these things were innovations in their own time, and they were designed to solve a problem, and they did. The problem is we kept them, right? And we have to change again, right? But innovation can take many forms, and I simply point out another innovation I mentioned on multi-generational housing. We got away from one of the few parts of the world that people get old and we put them somewhere else. We put them to pasture. And some people are in a circumstance where they don't have somebody else that they can live with. But for those of us that choose to live with our parents, grandparents, right? We got to create monetary policy. We've got to create built environments where this becomes easier for people, right? And it's also a great way to live for those of us that can and want to live that way and be close to our families. We just talked about some of the ways to recalibrate finance. By the way, this idea of 50-year mortgages, ain't gonna work. All it's gonna do is recalibrate how much we're gonna charge people. It's gonna drive costs up, right? Besides that, does anyone here wanna pay over the next 50 years of their lives? No, no. We become renters. Except it's even more expensive than the rent, which actually right now isn't true. Rents are at least on par in a lot of places with mortgages that are much higher than those mortgage payments. Some of the things, by the way, in Rutland that we're just trying to do, this is just me and a bunch of the houses getting together, is hey, can we pool our money together and just pay people's down payments, right? We got the woman for Rutland County who helps people find, we have 22 agencies in the state of Vermont, no less than 22 agencies that subsidize housing in some way, shape, or form. For veterans, for people in welfare, for, there's all different kinds of agencies. The woman who helps people navigate that has 4 children, she's divorced, she rents a house, her rent is $3,600 a month. She refused a promotion because if she got the promotion, she wouldn't be able to afford her rent because her subsidy would go away. This is the woman who helps other people, hear what I just said, find them, right? She makes enough money to pay a mortgage. We could put her in a 1,500, 2,000 square foot home for $1,500 a month, $1,800 a month. That would be her mortgage. But she can't come up with 20%, because 20% in where we live, even for an old house, is like $100,000, right? How do we get rid of these? So that's what I mean by innovation, right? How do we, these are just structural challenges we can get rid of. They're not that hard, we just choose to not do it, at least not yet. The last thing I just want to say in conclusion, hopefully people have something to say to me, things we can say together. I think the 3 most important things to being a good developer, to being a good houser, I think in general in life, is these 3 right here. Stewardship, a sense of stewardship. The word stewardship really speaks to a sense that of long-term thinking, of care, right? And also that we're not going to be here forever, and we should value each other, we should value the environment we're in, right? The idea of empathy, everybody here, I think, we've heard empathy over and over again today. And then lastly, humility. When we talk about the built environment, we talk about building things. The way I would describe humility and what it means in this context, in this idea in the 20th century of sort of central planning, right? We valued expertise over local opinion. We told people in cities in the middle of the 20th century, you're going to need to leave because the Massachusetts Turnpike has to go through here. Or, you're going to live over in this neighborhood, this subsidized housing project. You can't live where you used to live. Your old neighborhood, getting rid of this old dilapidated neighborhood. And we got rid of a lot of these mixed-use neighborhoods that were the lifeblood of their cities. And even though they might have looked a little bit careworn, there was a lot of value, both municipal tax value, but also just social and economic value being created by the families who lived and worked and owned property in those neighborhoods. Those decisions were not local. They were not bottom-up. They were made by central planning, right? Central planning also gave us great things like you go in any city in America and you sit at a bus stop, right? Keep in mind that the bus stop, the traffic signal poles around you, all the public infrastructure around you was designed to break, to collapse when a car hits it, right? Because, well, we don't want the person in the car to get hurt. But what about the person in the bus stop, right? So that's what happens when there's no public input. So humility in this context means that people with skill, we need people with skills, technical skills, to accomplish what we're going to do. But those people have to say, well, what do you guys want in your neighborhood? What do you want me to build? How do you want us to build it? What are the things that mean something to you? And that's what I mean by humility. So lastly, I'll just say, create the right instead of avenging the wrong. Anyone have any stories? Anything they can say?
Hello. I thought this was very interesting. One thing that I that stood out to me was how much it's multivariable. We're not just talking about housing, we're also talking about jobs, wages, infrastructure. So how do you go about, because you do housing, how do you go about building the housing and hoping that all those other pieces fall into place as well?
So there's moments where we compartmentalize things, especially anything really technical, because you have to break stuff down so you can understand it and you can work with it, right? So like in the day-to-day as a developer, I'm not trying to address absolutely everything on this list, right? But since we're here today and we're talking about policy, what I'm saying is each one of us that specializes in some major component of this policy, whether we're talking about people trying to put together a national housing policy for the party, or working for a city, right? You cannot, a mature conversation has to recognize that this is part of a poly crisis, and that you can come up with solutions, but then you have to go talk to the other people that are working on the other components of this, right? We can do a lot with a national housing policy. We can build the wider spectrum of housing. We can build a lot more inventory, so rents and mortgages come down to some extent. We can do all that, right? But if somebody's not focusing on the economy and creating more opportunities for people to work and make a decent wage, it's still going to have a positive effect, but it's not going to have the effect that the country needs. Right? It's not going to meet all needs, right? So I don't have a good answer to say, oh, how do we magically, because there is none, right? That having been said, we've dug this hole for ourselves over the last 80 years or so. We've dug ourselves out of holes before. It can be done. We got to get dinner right. Oh, no, Scott, yeah, has something.
Very interesting. So, taking a step back from what you just presented, the conventional way of moving forward with the sort of insights and things that you share is to basically become a policy wonk and understand all the different angles that you presented, and at the same time incorporate that into party policy, into party campaign platforms, get elected, get majorities where you can start to actually affect policy and regulation and budgets and so forth. And then sort of, and as the years pass, maybe make a dent in the kind of situation you're describing. But it's a long climb up to, first of all, significant party status, and second of all, to actually power that you can wield to change the thing. Because a lot of the solutions are very simple. They're like creating funds to improve dilapidated infrastructure over the long run, and doing more infill development and more multi-family, multi-generational housing, and it's dollars and cents, and most of it can be done. It's been done successfully in many cities and other parts of the world. But it's a long, slow process, and what I'm thinking is there like a shortcut that makes a dent but is more symbolic and very visible that the YNP could undertake that other political parties just don't do, but could involve more creative, attention-getting, more than advocacy, actually like activity. Like I had this image in my mind as you were talking about like what if the party organized teams to actually go out and deal with specific properties that need a certain package of expertise and solutions to make one small local landlord and their tenants' life better. And then the team spent a month or two on this. It's very time-consuming, very labor-intensive to begin with. But on the front of the house, there's a YNP sticker, and people go, "Oh, that's a YNP house. They did that number on it that looks like the way forward." If that kind of thing is successful, then there could be 2 teams, and there could be 3 teams, and there could be 4 teams, and there could be a kind of packaging and a rollout of a kind of emergency solution for this type of thing, and not wait around for policy on a grand scale that takes years and years and years to implement. Thank you.
This is why I hang out with Ralph, because he answers his own questions. So, so we just talked about something that's a really broad level, and there's the short term, right? There's nothing more immediate like, hey, I don't have a place to live, or I'm paying 60% of my income for my house, and the next, 5% increase in my rent, I'm out on the street, right? And those are like literally good. That's a good idea, by the way. I can only speak to what we're doing. A bunch of us housers got together in Rutland. We created it. To call it an organization is to be too formal. We call it Partners in Housing. And one of the things we're doing is taking a look at, can we pool our money together and put the down payment down to people? And how do we then take that equity back out, give it to the next person as quickly as possible to get people into homes that can afford. This is increasingly a problem for people, I'd say, 40 years old and younger, right? That they're making enough income to pay a mortgage. They're paying more in rent than if they had a mortgage, but the down payment's a moving target, and it's just, in a desirable place, is too much money. So I do think that two things I'll finish with. One is coming up with things you can do today, small things, right? It has to involve directly addressing a problem, one or more of the problems that's happening in your town right now for people that's related to housing. The other was, what you said was so fantabulous. The idea that as a party, that we could be doing things. So I'll give you an example that is a variation of what we could be doing. There's a professor, I think it was either Utica or Binghamton. It was one of the cities out in that part of New York State some years ago, right? Another challenge is in poor neighborhoods, there are more people than you think that can afford to fix their houses up, right? But if you're living in a neighborhood that's been on a downward economic spiral for a long time and nobody's fixing up their houses, people look and they go, I don't want to be the one fool that paints my house, because I ain't going to see this money back, right? Or doing big expensive repairs, which of course brings down the overall aggregate value of the homes in that neighborhood, right? So they figured out, how much it was going to cost for people to do simple stuff, starting with the exteriors, right? And they would come to your house. We'll fix the porch, and then we'll paint it, right? They went to their city and said, can we have $20,000, $30,000 from somewhere? And we'll just show, right? And they went and did a couple of houses, right? And it was a success. So then they did a few more and a few more and a few more. Then they started to give the grants out directly to the homeowners. Homeowners had a very specific period of time to get it done. So this is one example of something that was done relatively fast, right? This all started to happen and grow within a matter of a year or two, right? It directly addressed a problem. And then it became something that the group that had initiated it could, as you're saying, put a sticker on it, What can the party do to go out and directly have a positive effect at the neighborhood level? I'm sure there's a number of things we can do. And then letting the different committees, the state committees, it's probably a little different town to town, state to state, right? And then at the same time, we learn from each other. Hey, look at that, it's working over in Vermont, maybe we want to do that over in Connecticut, that kind of thing. Yes.
Can I just project so I don't have to go up there?
Yes.
Just a quick note. So my name is Katerina. I'm a new homeowner. It took 4 years and over 150 houses to look at. But something that I faced as a new homeowner was very expensive buy-in costs outside of the initial deposit. For instance, you have in Connecticut, the worst snowstorms that we've ever experienced. The expenses of buying a generator when we lost electricity for 48 hours, or a lawnmower, or anything related to snow, moving snow. And it was just in addition to the expenses of just having a house and paying a mortgage, and all these really short-term expenses that you use the lawnmower 6 months out of the year, it's just been a lot. But I read about a library down south that they have items that are donated, and people can actually check out these items. So if they need to use a sewing machine, or if they need to have like a lawnmower, or if they have to have like a leaf blower or something like that. Like, they're able to just like check that out. So that's like, as you were talking about like, just short, like, how can we help, like, just in like very small, like, projects. I think that that's one way, like, just reaching out to your local library and just saying, like, if we get this started, like, there's a lot of people that are moving, that are like going on Facebook Marketplace, like, is there a way that like you can have them donate to the library instead? So, but do you see that as like a viable option?
Any and all of these type of things that they're really grassroots, and you might at first think, what's that going to do for the longer? It's all incremental. That also has a social function, where people are more likely to bump into each other when they go to the library to go take these things out, right? And it's going to be different town to town, but it's these small things that we could do as a party that lead to a longer term strategy around housing. Also helping people understand, I love Habitat for Humanity. My wife and I have volunteered for them for 2 decades. Our local Habitat, ironically enough, they won't let me volunteer anymore. You know, so they've been putting people in homes. They had a case where this family was given the house. They called up a few months later, once winter set in, said, "Yeah, are we done?"
Finish.
Okay. Finish the story. Very short story. No one had explained to them. Vermont has very few gas infrastructure. It's mostly, believe it or not, home heating oil still. No one had explained to them that your house is heated by oil, and that you have to go and you have to order the oil, you have to buy the oil. So as it turns out, even though they got this house for very little money, or no money, number one, they couldn't afford home heating oil. Right now in Vermont, that's like, could be $4 or $5 grand for a tank. They didn't understand that you need the oil. So when we were trying to, as housers, the housers got together and said, our solution was, let's create both for renters and for new homeowners, like education. Well, that's talking down to people. That's what we were told by the nonprofit. I said, it's not talking down to people if people have been literally living in generations of poverty and they've never owned a home before. The heat just magically comes on. Well, yeah, if you didn't know where the heat comes from, we shouldn't assume that people just know these things, right? You don't learn to balance a check by just knowing it. Somebody has to show you how to balance the checking account, right? There's a lot of this very small stuff many of us will take for granted that actually would be a great way for us to interact with our local folks.
Absolutely. First and foremost, yes, thank you, Scott. Wonderful presentation. There's so much to unpack there. Certainly, I think that this necessitates wider conversation within the YNP around that national housing strategy. Necessitates the conversation around new tables. No, just kidding. But also what we can do on the local level as party members to make a real difference in our communities without waiting to be in office. Or leveraging local offices to make more substantive impacts than our counterparts may have on different town and city councils. So there is a lot of follow-up to be had based on this, and thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.